I still remember the way the sunlight would filter through the lace curtains in my childhood bedroom, dust motes dancing lazily in the golden morning. There was a softness to those mornings, a quietness that made the world seem far away, almost dreamlike. I was small then, too small to understand the longings stirring inside me, but there was a certain thrill in the way fabric felt beneath my fingers. My sister's dresses hung in the closet like tiny, colorful flags of a world I could barely imagine. I'd sneak in when she was at school, heart-pounding, and touch the silk ribbons, smooth cotton, the faint smell of her perfume clinging to the seams. It was innocent curiosity, I told myself, but there was a secret joy, a warmth that spread through me that I couldn't name. I remember trembling as I lifted a pale blue dress from its hanger, feeling the delicate weight of it, imagining the reflection I would see if only the mirror were mine to gaze into. I had no words then, only the quiet acknowledgement that these moments made my chest feel full and strange all at once, and that whatever this feeling was, it had to be hidden. My parents' laughter drifted up from the kitchen, a sound I loved and feared because it reminded me that the real world was outside, strict and expectant, waiting for me to fit a shape I didn't yet understand. Evenings were the hardest. After dinner, the house would settle into a hush, and I would tiptoe back to the closet, holding my little stolen treasure close, imagining the long lines of silk cascading down my body, imagining a self that felt freer, lighter. I learned early that desire and fear could exist together in one small chest, a contradiction I carried in silence. I couldn't speak it aloud, not to my parents, not to anyone, and yet I craved the tenderness of those moments, the private sanctuary of being someone unbound by the labels pressed upon me by the world outside my room. I sometimes wondered if other children felt the same way, or if I was utterly alone. This feeling became a constant companion, a whisper in the quiet corners of my mind, shaping me even before I could name myself. By the time I reached my teenage years, my curiosity had grown into a subtle, almost obsessive need to explore this other side of me. I started to make small allowances, wearing a scarf my mother had knitted, borrowing a hat or a blouse under the guise of necessity. Each experiment was filled with a trembling excitement and a sharp undertow of anxiety, because the stakes felt unbearably high. What if someone saw? What if they laughed? Or worse, were disappointed in me? I learned to be careful, to slip into these roles only when I was alone, to fold them neatly away like fragile glass once the moment passed. Still, the pleasure of self-expression was undeniable, a light in the shadowed corridors of adolescence. School life made me learn discretion quickly. Boys and girls had defined territories, and I felt like a trespasser in both, a ghost hovering on the periphery. I made friends, I laughed, I played, but inside, the other self waited patiently for the night. The closet became my sanctuary, my confessional, and my stage. Sometimes I would dress slowly in front of the mirror, letting the reflection grow familiar, not frightening, until I could almost believe it was always there. I could see glimpses of who I wanted to be, and in that mirror, it seemed possible that one day I might inhabit that self fully. But fear was patient, too. Fear would wait behind my eyes, whispering about shame, about ridicule, about a world too cruel to allow such tenderness. And so I lived in halves, a secret tucked into my chest, a story untold. By the time I left home for college, the weight of my secret had grown heavier, though it had also become more familiar, almost comforting in its constancy. The dorm room felt vast and echoing at first, a blank canvas on which I could paint fragments of myself without the prying eyes of family or childhood friends. I discovered thrift shops tucked between brick buildings downtown, small stores with racks of forgotten clothes that smelled faintly of mothballs and memory. I would wander through them quietly, fingertips brushing over lace, chiffon, soft wool, anything that seemed to hum with possibility. I felt like a thief, not in the sense of taking what wasn't mine, but in the sense of stepping into a life that the world hadn't designed for me, a life that had to be discovered in shadows and whispered breaths. There were nights when I dressed in the privacy of my room, candlelight flickering over the folds of fabric, listening to the hum of the city beyond the window. I'd stand before the mirror, tracing the lines of my reflection with tentative fingers, feeling an ache that was both joy and sorrow. Sometimes I cried softly, overwhelmed by the beauty of the person I saw and the impossibility of showing them to anyone else. In those moments, I realized that this was not a phase or a whim, but a core part of who I was, a truth too delicate to bear in full daylight, yet too persistent to ignore. My roommates were kind, oblivious, absorbed in their own lives, and I envied them for their freedom, for the ease with which they could exist without the careful choreography that my own life required. Family visits were bittersweet. My mother would fuss over my room, straighten the bed, and ask if I was eating enough, if I was sleeping well. She had a way of seeing me that I always felt simultaneously loved and scrutinized. I longed to tell her, to let her see the self that shimmered behind my eyes, but fear always tethered my tongue. What would she say? Would she understand, or would she retreat into disbelief, leaving me stranded in embarrassment and shame? And yet, there were moments of closeness that gave me courage. Quiet evenings when she would hum to herself in the kitchen, or the way her hand lingered on mine when she was handing me something, as if to say, "I am here, and I love you no matter what." Those moments became my anchors, my silent reminders that love could exist even when the truth remained unspoken. Romantic feelings only complicated things further. I found myself drawn to women in ways that felt conventional, safe, and yet even those feelings were tinged with shadows of longing for a different expression of self. I dated cautiously, laughed when it felt right, kissed when it felt safe, but inside, I carried a longing that could not be soothed by ordinary affection. I wanted to be seen, yes, but seen in a way that acknowledged the totality of who I was, the pieces that even my closest friends and partners could not comprehend. It was lonely, profoundly so, and I began to write to cope. Letters never sent, diaries never read, each page a confessional, each word a small act of liberation. Fear remained a constant companion. Fear of ridicule, of rejection, of a world too rigid to embrace the fluidity of identity. I remember one afternoon, standing frozen in the mirror of a department store changing room, hands pressed against the soft fabric of a dress I had dared to try, heart hammering, convinced that someone would walk in, discover me, and shatter everything. And yet, even in that fear, there was a spark of joy, a confirmation that this self was worth protecting, worth nurturing, worth daring to glimpse even if only in stolen moments. That tension between vulnerability and courage became the rhythm of my life, a quiet beat that guided me through the uncertain days and sleepless nights. I began to realize that these moments of dressing, of reflection, of quiet self-exploration were not mere indulgences. They were acts of survival, of honesty, of slowly carving out a space in the world where I could exist fully. I began to understand that fear, while ever present, could coexist with beauty and love, and that acceptance, both of myself and of the world's limitations, was a journey, not a destination. Each day, each secret moment, was a step on that path, and though I could not yet see the end, I could feel the contours of something larger taking shape, a life that could hold both longing and fulfillment, both caution and courage. Work became another stage on which I had to perform a version of myself that was carefully constrained, polite, conventional. I built a career, one that demanded competence, reliability, and above all, a steady face that never wavered, never hinted at the complexities roiling beneath the surface. Colleagues were friendly, sometimes warm, but I learned to measure everything I said, to hide the tremor in my voice that might betray the inner life I kept locked away. Evenings after long days of meetings, of presentations, of smiles that felt rehearsed, I would come home to my small apartment, shut the door, and breathe. That was when the dresses emerged again, when the scarves, the soft fabrics, the simple indulgences of color and texture became my sanctuary. I would fold the clothes, hang them carefully, as if by honoring them I could honor myself, each piece a talisman against the weight of a world that demanded conformity. There were moments when I almost gave up, when I wondered if the effort to conceal, to navigate the expectations of family, society, and colleagues, was worth the price. I remember a winter afternoon, snow drifting lazily past the window, and I sat at my desk staring at a dress I had brought home from a thrift store, the pattern delicate, muted, and I felt a profound ache. Who am I really? I whispered to myself, almost aloud. And for the first time, the answer was not shame, not confusion, but recognition. I am this self too. I am both the competent professional and the quiet dreamer who cradles a secret wardrobe in the corners of my life. And maybe, just maybe, that is enough. Family dynamics continued to be both comforting and challenging. My parents aged, their voices softened, their gestures slower, but their eyes still carried the same warmth and subtle scrutiny. I never revealed my secret to them, not fully, but there were small cracks in the wall of pretense, a scarf left casually on the chair, a blouse mentioned in passing, and the faintest flicker of understanding in my mother's eyes that I could not name. It was terrifying, exhilarating, and oddly tender, because it reminded me that love does not always require full disclosure to exist, that sometimes the heart recognizes truth before the lips do. Romantic relationships were a different terrain altogether. I met someone once, kind, patient, curious, and I felt the stirrings of a bond that could have bridged the chasm between concealment and expression. I wanted to show them, to share the hidden parts of myself, but the fear of rejection was overpowering. I carried on with small gestures, letting them see my favorite scarf, choosing colors I knew they liked, speaking in tones that hinted at something deeper. Love, I discovered, could be both expansive and limiting, and sometimes the most intimate connections are forged in glances, in shared silences, in unspoken understanding. There were also moments of sharp panic, moments when I almost lost control of the careful balance I had cultivated. Once, in a hotel room on a business trip, I opened the suitcase and pulled out a dress I had packed on a whim, only to hear a knock at the door. My heart leapt into my throat. Every muscle tensed. I hid the dress, smoothed my hands over the fabric of my shirt, and waited for the knock to pass, but the memory of that fear lingered. It was a vivid reminder that the world outside was rarely forgiving of deviation, that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to continue despite it. And yet, with every secret moment, with every quiet evening spent in front of the mirror, I felt a slow transformation within myself. The self I had tucked away, the self I had whispered to in the solitude of my youth, began to feel less fragile. I began to accept that my identity was layered, multifaceted, and that hiding it did not diminish its value. It simply delayed its full flowering. In small ways, I started to integrate this side of myself into daily life, choosing softer colors in my wardrobe, appreciating the textures and cuts of clothing, allowing myself moments of reflection in front of the mirror, without guilt or fear. And in those moments, I understood something profound, that acceptance begins within, and that the courage to be oneself is not a dramatic gesture, but a series of quiet choices made day by day. Each time I allowed myself to linger a little longer in front of the mirror, to touch the fabric I loved, to imagine the person I could be, I was rewriting the narrative of my life. I was telling myself, slowly, lovingly, that I was deserving of compassion, tenderness, and recognition, even if the world was not yet ready to understand. As the years passed, the rhythm of my life shifted in ways I hadn't anticipated. Colleagues retired, friends moved away, and my parents grew older, slower, their voices carrying the soft tremor of age. I noticed the changes in myself too, the slow accumulation of experience, the subtle lines etched by laughter and worry, the way my hands bore the traces of decades spent building a life carefully curated, outwardly conventional, inwardly complex. The dresses, the scarves, the small treasures of fabric and texture remained steadfast companions. They were reminders of continuity, of a self that had endured fear, secrecy, and doubt, and yet had never been extinguished. One autumn afternoon, I returned to the neighborhood of my childhood. The old house stood quietly, the garden overgrown, the sunlight slanting through the trees as it had so many years ago. I wandered through the rooms, memories stirring like dust motes in the golden light. I could see myself as a small child again, hands trembling over a blue dress, heart pounding with the thrill and terror of being caught, of being known. The memory was vivid, almost tactile, the softness of the fabric, the faint perfume that clung to it, the quiet ache of longing that had never truly left me. I realized then that those moments had been more than curiosity. They had been the seedlings of self-discovery, the first tender acknowledgement that I had a right to exist as myself, however quietly or tentatively. It was during these years that I began to confront the question of honesty, not just with others but with myself. I wrote letters I would never send, confessions that existed only on the page, yet they carried a weightless liberation. I began to speak aloud in my apartment, narrating memories to no one in particular, letting the words fall into the air as if saying them out loud made them real. "I am allowed to love who I am," I whispered one evening, staring at the reflection in the mirror, draped in a soft green dress that swirled around my knees. The words felt strange and powerful, as if speaking them had unlocked a door I had long feared to open. There were moments of fear, naturally, because the world has a way of reminding us that deviation can be dangerous, even in small, private ways. Once, while visiting an old friend, I noticed their gaze linger on my scarf, a subtle curiosity in their eyes. My heart thudded in my chest, a reminder of decades of caution, of hidden truths. Yet I also realized that the fear was no longer absolute. I had practiced courage in quiet, incremental ways for so long that the smallest act of visibility no longer felt catastrophic. I could exist, at least in fragments, in the presence of others, and that was a remarkable discovery. Family became a profound touchstone in these years. My parents aged further, their bodies frail but their love persistent, unyielding. I never fully revealed my secret to them, yet I found ways to bridge the gap. A carefully chosen scarf at Christmas, a blouse admired and returned, small acts of connection that carried meaning beyond words. And in return, I received gestures of affection that were quiet but unmistakable. The way my mother would place her hand over mine when she thought I wasn't looking, the way my father's laugh would linger in the doorway, a reminder that love, even when filtered through generations of caution and expectation, could survive. The transformation I experienced was subtle, almost imperceptible, but profound. I learned that identity is not a single, rigid construct, but a mosaic, composed of moments, choices, fears, and joys. I began to see that courage is often quiet, cumulative, and that self-acceptance does not require applause or approval, only the willingness to honor oneself day by day. I started to mentor younger colleagues, to listen with patience, to offer gentle encouragement to those navigating their own secret landscapes. In doing so, I realized that my own journey, once so solitary and fraught with fear, had cultivated empathy, understanding, and a deeper capacity for love. Sometimes, in the quiet evenings, I would stand in front of the mirror, draped in a favorite dress, and feel a surge of gratitude. Gratitude for the self that had endured, for the moments of secrecy that had become acts of courage, for the small victories of being alive, visible, and true. I reflected on the paradox that the most intimate, private experiences had shaped the public life I led, had given me the patience, insight, and resilience to navigate the world with subtle grace. And I realized, with a gentle, almost astonished wonder, that happiness is often not a grand revelation but a quiet, persistent unfolding, a recognition that you are allowed to exist fully, tenderly, and without apology. As I moved deeper into the later years of my life, I began to notice a shift that was both subtle and profound. The secret self that had once lurked in shadows now felt like an enduring companion rather than a source of shame. I still dressed in the quiet of my apartment, lingering over the textures and folds of fabric, feeling the familiar thrill of being wholly myself. But there was no longer the same desperation, the same acute fear that had accompanied me through youth and midlife. Instead, there was a gentle reverence, a recognition that these moments were a testament to survival, courage, and authenticity. I thought often of my younger self, the child trembling with excitement over a sister's dress, the adolescent standing in department store changing rooms, heart racing with terror and longing. I would speak to them silently, offering reassurance. You survived, you endured, and you became more than your fear. That perspective, that kind of tender reflection, brought a quiet joy unlike any other. It was as if the years had stitched together all the fragments of me, the cautious, the fearful, the bold, the tender, into a coherent, imperfect, beautiful whole. Family remained central, though the dynamics continued to evolve. My parents were now frail, their voices softer, movements slower. I could see the traces of time etched in their hands, their eyes, their laughter. And in these later years, I felt a desire to create small bridges between the self I had hidden and the connections that mattered most. A carefully chosen gift of fabric, a scarf draped in a way that invited quiet recognition, small moments of intimacy that needed no explanation. They became ways to honor both my journey and the love that had surrounded me all along. And in these gestures, I realized that love does not always demand full understanding. It flourishes in patience, presence, and the gentle acknowledgement of being seen, even partially. Romantic love, too, took on a different shape. I had learned that connection is not always about shared visibility, about full disclosure, but about the resonance between hearts, the capacity to hold each other gently, tenderly, without judgment. I cultivated relationships that honored this understanding, built on trust, empathy, and the unspoken recognition of each other's inner landscapes. In doing so, I discovered a quiet courage that had nothing to do with drama or declaration, but everything to do with steady, patient love, the kind that deepens over decades and leaves a warmth in the soul long after words fade. I began to share pieces of my story more openly, not in grand announcements, but in conversations, letters, and reflections. Younger friends, colleagues, even distant family members responded with curiosity, empathy, and sometimes surprise. I learned that vulnerability, when offered with gentleness and honesty, could foster understanding rather than judgment. Each time I allowed a fragment of my hidden self to step into the light, I felt an internal expansion, a widening of the heart that reminded me, secrecy had once protected me, but openness nourished me. The journey was never about seeking validation. It was about embracing the fullness of who I was, with tenderness and courage. And there were quiet, transformative moments that surprised me. The way light would catch on a scarf, how the wind would brush through a favorite dress as I walked near the park, the comforting rhythm of candlelight against fabric while the city hummed beyond the window. These were small, ordinary experiences, yet each carried the weight of decades of hidden longing, fear, and self-discovery. I began to see that transformation is rarely sudden. It is incremental, layered, and often imperceptible until one day you realize that you are different, not in what the world sees, but in the steadiness and compassion with which you see yourself. By this stage of my life, I could look back on the long arc of my journey with a mix of awe and gratitude. The secret desires, the whispered confessions to mirrors, the hours spent in quiet contemplation of fabric and form, they were not frivolous indulgences, but essential acts of self-preservation and self-affirmation. They had carried me through fear, through shame, through the relentless pressure of expectation. And in return, they had gifted me resilience, empathy, and the capacity for a deep, enduring tenderness, not just toward others, but toward myself. Now, as I sit in the quiet of my apartment, sunlight spilling across a worn armchair, I can trace the lines of my life like a map. Each wrinkle, each shadow, each soft fold of memory a testament to the journey I have walked. The dresses, the scarves, the soft fabrics I have cherished are no longer simply objects of secret longing. They are companions, reminders of resilience, markers of a self that refused to be erased by fear or expectation. I touch them gently, and I feel the decades behind them, the whispered conversations with my younger selves, the slow accumulation of courage and tenderness that has shaped me. I think often about the child who first touched a sister's dress, trembling with awe and excitement, and I feel a tenderness that is almost sacred. I wish I could gather that small self in my arms and say, "It is okay. It is always okay. You are seen. You are loved. You are enough." And I realize now that saying it to them is also saying it to me, to the young adult who feared exposure, to the professional who performed daily in the theater of conformity, to the older self who has finally learned that authenticity is a quiet, patient triumph. There is a profound peace in acknowledging that life's journey is rarely linear. Fear and longing, secrecy and revelation, joy and sorrow, they coexist, intertwined in ways that make life both difficult and beautiful. I have learned that acceptance is not a destination, but a practice, a daily choice to honor who you are, to extend compassion to yourself even when the world does not fully understand. I have learned that love can exist in fragments, in glances, in the quiet recognition of a heart open and attentive. I have learned that courage is small, persistent, and tender, and that each act of authenticity, however private, ripples outward in ways we may never see. Sometimes, when the wind catches the fabric of a favorite dress and it swirls around me like a quiet celebration, I smile at the improbable, wondrous continuity of life. I am reminded that identity is not a single, rigid shape imposed by the world, but a living, breathing mosaic, crafted through years of discovery, patience, and sometimes trembling courage. I am reminded that the self I have nurtured, protected, and embraced is not a fleeting whim, but the truest, most enduring part of me. As the light fades into evening, I reflect on the lessons the years have offered, that fear is natural, but it need not be permanent, that secrecy can protect, but openness can heal, that love and acceptance begin within before they can be extended outward. I think of the family who has loved me in their way, the friends who have seen me in fragments, the self I have always carried, and now honor fully. And I realize with a quiet, steady awe that the journey has always been worth it. Every trembling moment, every whispered confession to mirrors, every stolen hour of reflection has brought me here, to a place of peace, gratitude, and gentle celebration of the person I am. The reflection in the mirror is no longer frightening, no longer secretive. It is simply me, aged, weathered, and tenderly human. I smile, running my hands along the fabric of a favorite dress, and feel a fullness I have longed for all my life. I have learned to love myself wholly, to embrace the quiet triumphs of authenticity, to honor the delicate, enduring mosaic of my identity. And in this, I have discovered a truth as simple as it is profound, that living gently, honestly, and courageously is a life well lived. And so I sit here, wrapped in memory and fabric, heart steady, feeling the warmth of a long journey finally settled within me. I have carried fear, hope, longing, and love across decades, and in doing so, I have found peace. I have found acceptance. I have found the quiet joy of being wholly, tenderly, unapologetically myself. And with that, I am content. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to my channel.